Conference, let me begin by thanking each and every one of you for sacrificing the first few days of the winter break to attend this conference. It certainly is appreciated that after another busy term, you spend the first day of the holidays packing your bags before making the journey to Sydney from all over New South Wales to take part in the framing of policy for this union on behalf of the membership. Annual conference is an embodiment of the power behind the words of our conference theme, Teachers Working Together. But what do we mean by working together? We all know what we mean in a union sense by the word together. It goes to traditional trade union concepts of unity, solidarity and democratic decision-making. It's about the power of compromise, the building of coalitions and the development of the collective spirit. It's about the power of that first-person plural we. But what do we mean by working? What kind of work do we also need to do above and beyond our traditional campaigning? And during the address this morning, I want to concentrate on what kind of work we need to do together. And this address is a lengthy address, I apologise, but it should take about 35 minutes. What kind of work we need to do together as a united profession informed by our history so as to understand the present and shape the future. We need to analyse what is happening. Each union activist needs to become a researcher. We need to seek information, but more importantly, we need to share it across staff rooms, across schools, across states and across nations. And with that shared knowledge as our tool, we need to organise. Current times may well be regarded by future historians as the watershed years, a time when agendas were so profound as to change forever what we mean by civil democratic society. But it wasn't always so. When public education served to reinforce a conservative view of the state based on obedience and compliance and could reproduce this existing social order, it was generally supported by very powerful elites. But in the period following the Second World War, there was a massive expansion of public education systems fuelled by a combination of economic growth, post-war optimism and the resultant baby boom. Consequently, education levels steadily rose, reflecting greater participation and increased retention rates. And therefore many saw public education as a very powerful democratising force. By the 1960s, this democratic spirit was reflected in structural changes such as the expansion of comprehensive schooling, new curriculum that started to encourage critical thinking. In New South Wales, these policy shifts were reflected in the Wyndham scheme. More and more, the public school was seen as a social space owned collectively, where barriers to race, gender and class were, if not broken down, at least questioned. But almost immediately, the pushback began. Public education systems came under sustained attacks and a narrative of crisis and failure started to be developed. And this has roughly corresponded to the 35 years that I have been a teacher, although I'm loath to take all the blame. But it has led to about 3 decades of conservative reform, I would add in quotation marks, that is determined to weaken universal provision whilst protecting advantage. An education reform movement has grown, but it must be seen for what it is, a movement that I believe is profoundly anti-democratic. And my use of the term anti-democratic is deliberate. A word such as undemocratic tends to be limited to notions of the right to vote or freedom of speech. I want to distinguish what is happening with the term anti-democratic to reflect the change that is of dramatic and historical proportions. We are seeing the decline of the power of the nation-state in contrast to the power, influence and reach of corporations that is growing rapidly. Of the world's largest 100 economic entities, 40 are corporations. If Walmart was a country, it would be around the 22nd largest country in the world. And Walmart is one of the major financial backers of the charter schools movement in the USA. The market now seems to dominate all aspects of life, with boundaries between public and private breaking down. We are seeing public assets turned into private wealth, but that wealth is increasingly concentrated into the hands of the very few. This year, the combined wealth of Australia's richest 10 Australians is $73 $3.72 billion. 10 people. That is 5 times more than what 6 years of Gonski funding would deliver to schools. 10 people, as opposed to the 3.5 million students in all schools across the nation. And I just want to put these figures into some kind of perspective. 1 million expressed in seconds is about 11.5 days. 1 billion expressed in seconds is about 32 years. The BRW Richest 200 list puts the wealth of these 200 Australians at $196.6 billion this year, up from $176.8 billion last year. Just the increase in their wealth alone in 1 year is $19.8 billion. 1 year's wealth for 200 individuals is 1.3 times more than the 6 years of Gonski funding for 3.5 million students. Australia's largest coal mining company, Glencore Xstrata, gained $15 billion in profits over the last 3 years. During that period, it paid 0 tax. Not $1. This company's profit alone is $500 million more than the cost of 6 years of Gonski. And let's just look at this photo. It's of the Coalition front bench in Parliament taken last week, not celebrating funding for schools, but jubilant that they have succeeded in removing the carbon tax on behalf of these mining companies. And you can note that Christopher Pyne is there in the photograph. No wonder that around the globe there's an accelerating use of market mechanisms to drive social policy. Schooling appeared to be one area that may have been immune from this, but this is no longer the case. It is in this broader context that the political attacks on public education should be seen. I want to put what is happening in this country and in this state into a broader context that is critically important to learn from and share information. The so-called education reform movement could be described as the offspring of the late Cold War marriage of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Reaganism and Thatcherism, what sort of child would that produce? We know what child it produced. We could trace the DNA of just about every single major economic and social policy setting back to the era of Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the USA, the late 70s and 80s. It is worth gaining some understanding of the origins of educational policy in both the US and the UK and why today it influences policymakers in Australia. Under Thatcher and Reagan, education policy became heavily influenced by neoliberal economic theory. This has resulted in a broader global education agenda based on the contention that educational improvement will evolve by competition and the application of market forces through parental choice, along with business management and performance accountability mechanisms. And the speed at which this ideology shifts across borders has been described as an epidemic. The Conservative agenda for public education appears complex and all-encompassing, with so many fronts having opened up, including the fragmentation and privatisation of the public school system through charter schools, academies, trust schools, free schools, independent public schools, and the creation of specialist and selective schools. The whole devolution agenda, marketed under a variety of names such as school-based management, school autonomy, local schools, local decisions, independent public schools, principal empowerment, funding cuts to public schools, growth in vouchers, proliferation of government-funded private providers, the high-stakes testing agenda, at its worst in the US and in England, the stigmatising of public schools, school closures, teacher and principal sackings, the politicisation of school curriculum, including the sidelining of the professional voice of teachers and marginalising certain subjects, the loss of tenure, teacher salary cuts and wage freezes reinforced by performance bonus and merit pay schemes. Attack on teacher qualifications through programs such as Teach for Australia and its down under cousin, Teacher America and its down under cousin, Teach for Australia, employing non-educators in leadership positions and the demonising of public school teachers and their unions. The list is seemingly endless of what is happening. And it's no coincidence that it's being waged on so many fronts. Pasi Sahlberg, of course, calls it the germ, the global education reform movement, and it's probably a useful analogy. The right call it whack-a-mole, a fairground game where the little plastic mole keeps popping up and the kid's got a rubber mallet to pop them down. And of course the kids never win, the moles get popping up quicker and quicker. And that's, the right have described with some glee that the teacher unions around the world are really confronting the right's whack-a-mole strategy, that they will just exhaust themselves, they hope, in trying to combat so many different fronts. I want to break up the last 35 years into 4 waves. I believe we're now entering the 4th wave, which I hope I get to. But of course the waves are not strictly linear. They are multifaceted and cyclical, and they appear chaotic, but they have a dangerous coherence underpinned by deliberate and sophisticated use of language. The first wave is to weaken the public's or the citizens' trust in public education. This started in earnest in the late 70s and 80s. A truth had to be established that proved there was an educational crisis. High-stakes testing provided an endless source of data for this purpose. The crisis could then become a permanent state of affairs, and the whole area of curriculum then could start to be seriously contested. The second wave was to lay the blame for the crisis with the profession. And very simplistic dichotomies were established. Bloated education bureaucracies had stifled innovation, as opposed to the freedoms that could be enjoyed by self-managing efficient schools. Teacher unions protected the weak through collective agreements, as opposed to the incentive of merit pay for the gifted individual. Schools were controlled by distant bureaucrats, as opposed to local principals. Schools would always underperform unless exposed to competition and choice. Increased funding would be unsustainable, so schools need to operate more like businesses. Traditional schools no longer engage students, as opposed to the new technologies that do. The third wave was to convince the community there was a need for radical solutions, and the overriding solutions that were offered were almost always structural. And these structural changes almost inevitably led to the withdrawal of systemic support for schools, to governments retreating from any obligation to build, maintain, fund and staff schools. And this structural solution originally came in many guises: site-based decision-making, school-based management, site-based autonomy, local authority, local decision-making, devolved responsibility, local management of schools, and so on. But essentially all the models were cast from the same one-size-fits-all mould. To this day, the common features include increased centralised accountability mechanisms from which the profession is often alienated and powerless to shape, and an increased burden of responsibilities at the local level. Stephen Ball aptly described the reality as the self-management of decline. It was the massive structural changes to public education, devolved staffing responsibilities and budgets at the school level, which were the essential precursor to the 4th wave, which I'm about to describe. Not many of us saw it coming. Our opposition to devolution was for sound educational, resourcing and pedagogical reasons. But the right was breaking up school systems for a much more important reason. And so to the 4th wave, which has begun. And in many ways, from the right's perspective, it is the Holy Grail, the natural culmination of what has been happening over the last 3 decades or so. Weaken public confidence, divide the profession and break up the public school system. The 4th wave is the full privatisation agenda that is being pushed by enormously powerful corporations, or edu-businesses as they are called, and we can see their influence across the globe. Ravage describes the reform movement as really corporate reform funded to a large degree by major foundations, Wall Street hedge fund managers, entrepreneurs and the US Department. And the movement is determined to cut costs and maximise competition. And she talks about the replacing 150 years of public education, geographically based education system with competitive public schools, privately managed charter schools, for-profit schools, virtual schools and so on. She's written, along with a lot of other people, extensively on this. The corporate world now sees quite clearly education as a marketplace which could reap huge profits. Commercial interests have always been involved in education, from textbook publishing to equipment supplies. However, what is happening more recently and encouraged by government is quite astonishing. Respected educator and academic, Professor Stephen Dinham, in a very recent address to the Australian College of Educators, described the process. Publishers are now moving into large-scale vertical integration whereby they have commercial involvement with curricula, teaching resources, teaching standards, teaching development and appraisal and student testing, in effect gaining control of the entire educational supply chain. One of the largest of these emerging edu businesses that Steve Dinham could well be referring to is the publishing giant Pearson. Pearson is a London-based British multinational and is the world's largest education company. It holds a 47% stake in Penguin Books and Random House, the world's largest consumer book publisher. It is a huge, highly profitable corporation with enormous influence. In the past, it has just published textbooks. It owns the Financial Times Group. More than 75% of its revenue comes from education, and it operates in over 70 countries, including Australia, and also designs software for standardised testing. In the USA alone, over half of all schools use at least one of the company's products, from assessment, curriculum, software or financial management. It's a partnership with Apple and has just recently handed out 47,000 iPads to students in Los Angeles with preloaded Pearson's curriculum on it. You can go to any school in Los Angeles, but the curriculum you'll be taught will be written by Pearson. Now it sees the future in education, software and online learning. One of its profitable arms is the teaching of English online, but it runs for-profit schools across Asia and Africa through a subsidiary called Amiga. And its target is for 70% of its sales to come from digital services by 2015. What's this got to do with New South Wales? Well, a few weeks ago, I attended on behalf of the Federation the first meeting of the Rural and Remote Education Advisory Group at the department, where it was announced that the department has entered into a commercial relationship with Pearson regarding the use of its software, just as it's about to launch the virtual classrooms in rural areas. As well, the Federation will be investigating whether the department, which we believe is the case, has engaged Pearson's to administer the NAPLAN test, even though it's a limited role at this stage. Should we be worried? I think so.
Conference, that's time, but a 10-minute... Oh, sorry, Maurie, I heard...
Yeah. Thank you.
No, we don't need the extension.
I haven't got to the punchline yet. Should we be worried? No, that was a rhetorical question. Sorry, I won't pause after the rhetorical, it slows me up. If overseas experience is anything to go by, we should be. Local schools, local decisions has seen the decimation of the curriculum director and the loss of professional learning unit, as well as regional support for schools. And into these vacuums, we see corporations like Pearson enter. One of the world's largest edu businesses, another one, is GEMS Education. By the way, Colonel Gaddafi was one of the major investors in Pearson before his untimely death. But the other big player is GEMS. It's owned by a family company headed by Sunny Varga, and it's based in Dubai. Visit their website, you'll see the clip, and it's absolutely blatant what they want to do. The former Deputy Prime Minister, Mark Vaile, is a consultant for GEMS Education. In an interview in the Sydney Morning Herald, Mark Vaile foreshadowed the presence of for-profit schools for Australian students. He said, "There are schools for profit in the UK and the US, so in an economy like Australia's, there will be that level of competition. They will eventually appear." As Trade Minister, though, Mark Vaile negotiated free trade agreements which included easier access for Australia for for-profit education providers to markets in Asia and the US. More recently, we have seen Tony Abbott visiting Rupert Murdoch in his New York apartment. Absolutely extraordinary. The King invites the minions up to court. The notion that a Prime Minister goes to someone's private apartment for an audience. But it's just extraordinary. And the following day, we hear, having received his instructions, Tony Abbott is considering an unprecedented Americanisation of the school education system with radical changes that could see HECS-style fees introduced into schools, into new continuous school and post-school diplomas, and private industry playing a heavy role in course design and production. So not content with having people get into debt when they're 17, let's get them into debt when they start school, and the money going into private companies. Another major player is News Corporation, and it's consistently editorialised in support of the education reform movement. It's a major player, and we should remind ourselves that it boasted in the Daily Telegraph in 12th of March that local decisions came about by constant pressure from this newspaper. Really, what we mean is constant pressure from Rupert Murdoch. In 2011, Murdoch, a strident critic of public schools, bought the US company Wireless Generation for $360 million. But after some negative publicity, because it was involved in testing software in New York City, he folded into Amplifier. And it's now, like Pearson, providing pre-loaded tablets to students in school districts, where the students can learn any type of curriculum but it will be Amplify Murdoch curriculum. As Murdoch said, when it comes to K through 12 education, we see a $500 billion sector in the US alone that is waiting desperately to be transformed by big breakthroughs that extend the reach of great teaching. Murdoch, in his capacity as the chairman and CEO of News Corporation, delivered a speech on the digital future and its connection to education to the G8 Forum in Paris in May 2011, where he spoke of the benefit for schools that are privately run for profit. Neoliberal ideology argues that public school systems are an example of a government monopoly that needs to be broken up, and various trade agreements signed by national governments reinforce the notion of public utilities, including school systems, as monopolies. We have raised the issue of edu-businesses at the national level in the AEU. Many of you will be aware that I've just returned from a trip to Education International Conference in Montreal, where this agenda was discussed, and onto the UK and Sweden, where we investigated the privatisation agenda. And I've undertaken to write up the findings of this study trip on behalf of the AU delegation. I intend to make it available to both the Executive and Council, and if agreed, make it available to the wider membership. It is a charter school experiment that has become central to the privatisation of public schools in the US, and in the UK, of course, it's the move to establish free schools and academies, and many of these are operated by well-connected foundations and businesses, and very little financial accountability. Diane Ravitch says, again, there's the crusade by the far right has been to turn education to consumer choice rather than a civic obligation. And if we look at what's happened in England, we see that the structural changes that were the essential foundations for the privatisation agenda. And it goes back to Margaret Thatcher, where Derek Gillard wrote, the twin aims of Margaret Thatcher's education policies in the 1980s were to convert the nation's school system from a public service into a market and to transfer power from local authorities to central government. But she called it devolution. It's the same agenda. She legislated local school management motivated by a belief that public provision was always wasteful and ineffective. And then she would, and a bonus, of course, would be to disempower teacher unions. But there was nothing progressive or benign about it, even though the language was. It was about turning education into a marketplace. Each school was to thrive or survive in a new competitive environment. And it was only a matter of some time afterwards in New South Wales and later in Victoria that they borrowed heavily from Thatcher to introduce schools renewal in New South Wales by the Grinder government, of course, in '89, and Schools of the Future in '93 by Jeff Kennett. But we can fast forward to Blair, the Labor government of the UK, which took Thatcher's agenda and went so much further, established academies within the state education system in 2000, confirmed in legislation, and these are essentially the equivalent of the American charter school. They can turn what they call failing schools into academies, bypass the local education authority or the local government, if you like, and they are required to be sponsored by businesses. And there's money for jam for these billionaires who are getting into it. At the time of the 2010 election, there was 203 academies. By mid-2013 now, that's grown to over 3,000. Over 50% of secondary schools in the UK are now standalone academies, over 50%, and about 6% of primaries. So the extreme end of the school autonomy spectrum are the free schools that are being established. And the free schools was borrowed heavily from Sweden, which since the mid-90s allowed private for-profit schools to be established and receive full public funding. In 2013, one of these private school companies, JB Education, announced that it was closing. So it had approximately 10,000 students enrolled, and they just closed the 19 schools. They'd been bought earlier by a Danish private equity firm. Two of these firms, Swedish firms, are also owned by private equity. They now manage schools in the UK, and they're waiting for legislation to change so they can be run on a for-profit basis. And that is exactly what the Cameron government is intending to do. It intends that all schools will become standalone academies. And what it said in a leaked white paper, and it was leaked in February 2013, the minutes of a very high-level meeting, that they would hand all academies and all free schools, all academies, all free schools, remember over 50% of secondary schools are already academies, all of them over to the private sector to run on a for-profit basis. There's now something akin to a religious fervour that characterises what's happening in Britain around free schools. And of course we see what's happening in our own TAFE system. The commercial for-profit privatisation is already happening in Australia with our TAFE system, and schools could very well look at what is beginning to happen to TAFE. There's over 5,000 registered training providers already, and that figure's probably out of date. We see, as an example, a company called Vocation, floated on the stock exchange last year in December, valued at over $400 million. The chairman, former Labor Education Minister John Dawkins, received a $1.2 million reward payment for setting up the company and an annual director's fee of $200,000. That money came from the public purse. That was money that should have been going to the TAFE system but is now being given to these companies. So you contrast that to what's happening in the TAFE system and the loss of and budget cuts and the loss of staff. And of course the full-blown smart and skilled agenda next year will see the wholesale privatisation of TAFE. As I said at the outset, public education in Australia is at risk, not just because of the government neglect and underfunding, because our politicians act in concert with political allies in other countries to spread ideas and introduce market-based educational reform. All the policy settings that reflect the fourth wave of the reform agenda are here. The push for autonomous schools, opposition to Gonski, the attacks on what we teach, the Donnelly Review, attacks on our qualification, the privatisation of TAFE, and of course the introduction of these edgy businesses. But before I close, I want to give as some cause for optimism. We're not the USA, we're not the UK, we're not New Zealand, and while we learn from overseas, we must study our own material conditions as we develop our campaign resources. Over the years, we have done this well. We haven't fallen for simplistic responses. We haven't mistakenly conflated what is happening in one country with what is happening here. We've been strategic and sophisticated, and we've always been aware that no campaign will be successful unless we have widespread community support. To this end, we have significant support across the community, due in no small measure to every member sitting in this auditorium. As I said, we do have some cause for optimism, and some of our advantages are these. Our federal political system has dispersed power over education, making it more difficult than what has occurred in the UK. And the USA has already had a largely devolved system dating back to for a century or more. We have a united teacher movement, one professional voice in each state and one voice, the AEU, at the national level. All our sectors are covered and all teachers, including principals, are members. And unlike our counterparts in the USA and England, we have neutralised and quarantined the worst excesses of the testing agenda for now. Within our TAFE system, our advantage is the huge level of ownership the community has in TAFE, which is already translating into strong community support. We have slowed the pace and reduced the impact of devolution in New South Wales by protecting staffing levels and class sizes in the last staffing agreement, an extraordinary achievement. Of course, we must also list the school's funding campaign, Gonski, as the most significant setback for the right in many years, at a time when school education budgets are being cut under austerity measures in so many OECD countries. We've achieved 4 years of growth funding due to a highly visible and broadly supported campaign based within the community. It is a campaign that every politician and commentator in this country knows is not going away. But one great advantage is that we are aware of what the corporate agenda is and what instructions they have delivered to their political mouthpieces. The AEU has initiated a mapping exercise to assess the extent of corporate involvement in school education. We will not be ambushed so easily. I want to end with a warning from Stephen Dinham, taken from the same address he gave that I mentioned earlier. A tsunami comprises waves with very long wavelengths. Often these go unnoticed until it is too late to do anything about them. When they reach land, great devastation can result. The long wave of changes to education need to be subjected to intense scrutiny before it is too late. If the profession remains silent and passive in the face of some of these developments, we will only have ourselves to blame for what might eventuate. I thank Steve for this timely warning, but I feel the need to respond in this manner. He and anyone else in the community ought to know and remember this. The New South Wales Teachers Federation will never remain silent, and we will never be passive. We will remain true to our traditions, and we will use those traditions to protect the future of public education. After all, we remain teachers working together, and that is a formidable force.